On a freezing Christmas night, when most doors were locked and families were gathered by warm fires, a female police officer with no one left in the world knocked on the wrong door, and a single father answered, not knowing that one choice would unravel secrets buried in blood, sacrifice, and a past neither of them had survived. If you believe the smallest acts of kindness can change lives forever, subscribe now, because stories like this don't just entertain, they remind us who we are when the world goes dark. Christmas night arrived quietly in the city, the kind of quiet that settled after snow had fallen long enough to muffle traffic, sirens, and even loneliness, but Officer Claire Donovan still felt every empty echo as she drove her patrol car through streets glowing with lights that weren't meant for her, because at 34 she had no parents left to call, no siblings to argue with, no partner waiting with dinner, only a thermos of lukewarm coffee and a badge that had become both shield and prison since the night her family died in a drunk driving accident she hadn't been able to stop. And that night, when her shift should have ended early, a call came in about a stalled vehicle near a quiet suburban block, the kind of place where families laughed behind curtains, and Claire answered because that was easier than going home to a dark apartment. But when she arrived she found not a car but an elderly man whose house had lost power, and after helping him inside she realized her cruiser wouldn't start, the battery finally giving up after weeks of neglect, and with her radio dead and phone frozen from the cold, she did the only thing she hadn't done in years. She knocked on a stranger's door, and the door that opened belonged to Mark Holloway, a single father in his early 40s with tired eyes and a voice worn smooth by bedtime stories, who stood there holding a dish towel and blinking as if he couldn't believe a police officer was standing on his porch at midnight on Christmas, and Claire tried to explain quickly, professionally, but the words cracked because exhaustion finally won, and Mark noticed, stepping aside without hesitation, inviting her in as though this were the most natural thing in the world. And inside his home smelled like cinnamon and pine and something warm that made Claire's chest ache, and she noticed the small Christmas tree, modest and crooked, and the children's drawings taped to the fridge, and when Mark said his kids were asleep upstairs, that it had just been him and them since his wife died 3 years earlier from cancer, something unspoken passed between them, the recognition of people who had learned to survive rather than heal, and when he offered her tea, then food, then the couch, just until morning, Claire should have refused, but she didn't, because the truth was she had nowhere else to go and no one else who cared if she froze, and as she sat there in uniform while snow thickened outside, she felt something unfamiliar and dangerous settle in her chest. Safety, but what neither of them knew was that this Christmas kindness would reopen wounds Mark had buried with his wife, that Claire's badge carried secrets from an unsolved case tied to this very neighborhood, and that by morning, the past would come knocking harder than any winter storm, because sometimes the door you open out of kindness is the same door your fate has been waiting behind. Morning arrived not with bells or laughter but with the soft sound of a child's cough upstairs and the smell of toast burning slightly, and Claire woke on Mark's couch disoriented, her uniform wrinkled, her gun still holstered, her heart racing as instinct reminded her she was not supposed to feel safe anywhere, not like this, not after years of sleeping light and shallow, but the house was calm, warm, alive, and when Mark appeared from the kitchen apologizing for the noise, holding a mug with a chipped rim and offering it like a peace treaty, something shifted between them again, because it wasn't flirtation or romance but recognition, the quiet acknowledgement of two people who had learned how to function while broken, and then the kids came down, Evan, 12, guarded and watchful, and Lily, 7, curious and smiling, and Claire braced herself for questions, but instead Lily hugged her leg without warning, saying she dreamed about a snow angel in a blue coat, and Mark froze, because that was what his late wife used to wear, and Claire felt a chill unrelated to winter, because coincidences had a way of circling her life like unfinished business, and as breakfast unfolded awkwardly but warmly, Claire noticed a framed photo tucked slightly behind others, a woman who looked hauntingly familiar, and when she asked Mark where his wife was from, he said quietly, "She grew up here." Same block. Same streets, and Claire's stomach tightened, because this neighborhood wasn't just another patrol zone, it was the epicenter of a cold case she'd carried for 7 years, one involving a hit and run on Christmas Eve that had killed a young woman whose name had never left Claire's mind, a case that had stalled, evidence lost, witnesses silent, and as Mark excused himself to take a phone call, Claire stood too quickly and nearly dropped her mug when she saw the name etched on the back of the photo frame. Anna Holloway, the same name as the victim she'd sworn to bring justice to, the same woman whose death had put her on the path to becoming a cop, because Anna had been kind to Claire once, years earlier, during a routine stop, offering coffee and a smile when Claire was a rookie barely holding herself together, and now Claire stood in the living room of the woman's home, staring at her children, realizing with a sickening weight that the man who had taken her in last night was the widower of the woman whose case had haunted her career, and guilt surged, because Claire knew things Mark didn't, details that had been sealed, rumors about corruption, whispers of a local businessman whose name kept disappearing from reports, and when Mark returned, Claire tried to act normal, but the air had shifted, her badge suddenly heavy, because she knew now that the kindness he'd shown her came at a cost she might not be able to pay, and before she could decide whether to tell him the truth, a knock came at the door, not gentle, not neighborly, but sharp and official, and when Claire opened it, she found two men in suits who flashed credentials too quickly and spoke her name like a warning, saying there had been a development in an old case, that someone had finally talked, and that they needed her immediately, and Mark watched from behind her, his face pale, his hands clenched, because he recognized that look in Office's eyes, the look that meant bad news, unfinished grief, and as Claire stepped onto the porch, snow crunching beneath her boots, she realized Christmas hadn't brought peace at all. It had brought the truth back to the surface, and this time, it wasn't going to let either of them pretend anymore. By the time dusk fell again, Christmas already felt like a lifetime ago, and Claire stood in the interrogation room replaying every kindness Mark had shown her, every innocent moment with his children, while the two investigators laid out what she had suspected but never been able to prove. That Anna Holloway hadn't died in a random hit-and-run at all, that she had witnessed something she shouldn't have, a money laundering operation tied to a respected local developer who funded campaigns and police charities. That Anna had been followed, threatened, and finally silenced, and that the original case had been quietly buried by men who wore badges like Claire's, men who had decided justice was inconvenient, and when they asked Claire why she had never let the case go, she finally understood why fate had led her to Mark's door, because Anna had once helped Claire, and now Claire had unknowingly been helped by Anna's family, and when the investigators revealed that a witness had come forward, someone who had been a child at the time, someone who had recognized the driver, Claire felt her throat close when the name was said, because the witness was Evan, Mark's son, who had seen everything from an upstairs window and stayed silent out of fear after being warned, and Claire demanded to be the one to tell Mark, not as an officer but as a human being who owed him the truth. And when she returned to the house, the lights were on, the tree still glowing softly, but the warmth felt fragile, like glass ready to shatter, and Mark knew the moment he saw her face that something irreversible had happened, and when Claire finally told him everything, about Anna, about the cover-up, about Evan, the grief he'd buried under routine and responsibility tore back to life, raw and devastating, but instead of rage, something else surfaced, something steadier, because Mark had spent years protecting his children from the world, and now the world had come for them again, and when officers arrived later that night to formally take statements, Mark stood beside Claire, not against her, because despite the betrayal of the system, he saw the woman who had carried his wife's memory without knowing it, and weeks later, when arrests were made and headlines finally told the truth, Claire resigned from the force, not in defeat but in resolve, because she understood that justice sometimes meant walking away from a broken institution, and on the night the case closed, she returned to the Holloway house, not in uniform, not as an officer, but as someone who had nowhere else to belong, and Mark opened the door the same way he had on Christmas, without fear, without conditions, and when he told her she didn't need to knock anymore, that she already had a place there, Claire finally cried, not from grief but from release, because the cop with no family had found one, and the single dad who had once given a stranger shelter had unknowingly given his children a future where truth mattered, where kindness wasn't wasted, and where one open door on a cold Christmas night became the moment everything broken finally began to heal.